Hi there. In this presentation, I want to talk about differences between Workato and Microsoft tooling, and specifically about Workato as a usability tool, right? So it is much more useful, and what kind of governance it supports, but also how it's different from Azure and how it's different from Power Platform. Usually, when I talk about Workato, is that Workato is a integrated integration tool. That means that there is only one app a user needs to use, and it can be used by also different personas. Like for example, developer, the business user, or the admin. They all use Workato as the app. And in the Microsoft world, because it's split between the low code tooling, as you see here, Power Automate, Power Apps, virtual agents, and also the like professional development tooling, which is in Azure, you always need like another app to do different tasks. And that is like what I also want to discuss later. So, but the first thing, like in a, let's say, a very high level, what Workato is really better at is about the usability of how to use the app and how to use the integrations. And what I mean is that, as an example here, here is a Workato recipe that synchronizes some Excel data to dynamic CRM, right? Which, by the way, Microsoft tool. And only can do it in those 4 steps. While in Power Automate, it is required usually a lot of more effort and steps to do exactly the same thing. And a simple reason is typically that Power Automate only supports like one-to-one data synchronization, doesn't support even batch in its own Microsoft Dynamics. And typically in Microsoft world, you will need to go to Data Factory in Azure to do the same thing, while in Workato, you can do it all in one tool with just this step. Another thing that typically customers that have experience with Microsoft go with Workato is the governance problems. Officially in Power Platform, there is no governance framework. There is one that usually Workato, or sorry, Microsoft links to, but it's not actually supported by Microsoft themselves. And again, it then will have this all-in-one problem, which is it requires so much more effort because you need to learn all those different applications to do exactly the same thing in Workato. So let's go look a little bit deeper of the lack of governance first in Azure integration services. So when I talk about Azure integration services, really the 6 different services that Azure has, right? So it is the function, the logic app, so it's just part of those 6 official ones. There's a queue management, there is API management, there's like a pub sub, data factory, right? And all of those, here's like an example that I have done for a customer that does like a B2B integrations, which needs to control like its shipping and ship to different providers. Is that in Azure it will be all spun up as different services that you just have like a list on it, right? It's not just logic apps, which is what directly is comparable to Workato usually when customer sees Workato. It is really like API, it is functions, it is different like admin things like integration accounts, it is storage and so on, right? So in Azure, you will have all of this spinned up in different services, and there is no overview of where your integration actually starts, where the data flows, and where does it end, right? So there is no dashboard to view all of it. Typically, what you need to do in Azure is that you need to connect your own dashboarding and get all that data from those different environments. And also, you need to make sure you back it up yourself, because as you see here, for example, this API connection is spinned up in East US. But what if East US data center crashes? There is nothing that Azure integration services does it for you automatically. You need to do it yourself. In Workato, you do it. You don't need to do anything. It's all done automatically. It is managed through the, again, one interface for recipe, and you have one dashboard to actually see where the data flows from one place to another. So that's like important point, is that a lot of customers do not realize that Workata does, again, the backups, the failover, all the things for you. And also every time the job runs, Workato makes sure that to store it, right? In Azure world, you will need to store it somewhere, all those job logs, if you want to store it, for example, for 90 days or multiple years. And then there is a lack of governance in Power Platform, right? So while we discuss the lack of governance in Azure integration services, let's now go to Power Platform, which is Power Automate, Power Apps, all the chatbot interface and so on. And what in essence what Power Platform is, it is Dynamics 365, a stripped down version. Your usually okay, those people that use Power Platform, they know that, but some new people to Power Platform, they don't realize that in essence it's actually Dynamics 365 stripped down version in the background, and that has some weird quirks behind it. So first of the, let's say, not nice things with that is that there is really very few governance tools in there. Microsoft does link to Power Platform Center of Excellence toolkit, but this toolkit, as you can go yourself to this documentation, is not actually supported by Microsoft themselves. And the reason is that it has been created by the community, and Microsoft just links to it because it encapsulates a lot of things that are missing in Power Platform. Like again, just simply having a dashboard where it tells you where integration starts, where does it go, is it an MPI, like how do you see what is the result of it? Okay, and that is just not there. And what you are usually required as a customer that wants to expand this to globally is that you need to install this toolkit, which by the way consumes a lot of resources, requires Power BI Premium Edition, and it spins up lots of Power Automates and functions that basically consume its own resources just to give you the same thing that already is in Workato by default. Then another point is that really Power Platform is just an old reshuffled Dynamics 365, and there are some proving points about it, right? So for example, if you go to Power Automate and you go to administration mode or Power Apps for that matter, it doesn't matter. If you go and you want to change some settings like in Power Apps, how it is displayed, or change some settings about the users, you usually end up in the interface for the old Dynamics 365 interface. And you see that there are some inconsistencies here in the UI. For example, I'm here in the Power App, but I'm designing this interface and I'm actually in the CRM because, again, this is just an add-on originally designed for Dynamics CRM that is now sold as a standalone platform, but it still sits on the same SQL database as the CRM and the rest of the CRM. And that is just not nice from terms of usability, like when you want to use it, especially if you want to have a low code users on top of it, because they will get confused like really quickly. And here's just another examples like how it can look like with different pop-ups and so on. And because it is again in the background, that is Dynamics stack. And that is like the final couple of slides is that what Workato is and what it isn't, right? So Workato is an integration platform in the cloud, but built from the cloud ground up, right? It doesn't have any kind of like acquisitions that has been merged or any kind of legacy stack behind it. And it also doesn't rely on you opening and spinning up different tools in different data centers or let's say different apps, right? Like you would require. And let's go like a little bit deeper on that. So let's start comparing what usually is Workato compared to Azure Logic Apps because of the similarities how you build the blocks. But there are a lot of also things that are missing in Logic Apps which needs to be added. So for example, both are cloud, right? So both support on-premise agent, on-premise connectivity. Both are, let's say, easiest to use. Connectors, so when it comes to connectors, it's really easy to add new connectors, and Workato has more connectors. But in Logic Apps, a lot of those connectors, especially those 150 that I have here in parentheses, is to Office 365 internal things, right? Because so in reality, it's just we're talking about 400 connectors to something that is not Microsoft. It can do approvals, but then when it comes to, let's say you want to create some sort of web interface, like For example, you want to design, upload an Excel file and do some approval. If you want to do any kind of batch, like in my Dynamics example, you want to do an API endpoint to publish it in Happy. If you want to create any PubSub or create your own connector from scratch, you'll need to start expanding, right, from logic apps to different other interfaces. For example, if you want to do web, it's Power App, virtual agents for bots, Azure Data Factory. Suddenly we are, crossing the border here between Power Apps and then Azure again. You need to have Azure Data Factory for batch, Azure API for any kind of like API spinned up, Azure Event Grid for any kind of pub sub, and then SDK. That is typically like you need to do custom code within Logic Apps and publish it as an admin, right? So it's not super easy to do. And all of this requires its own approvals, its own licensing, its own basically contract to work with every time you give access to all those apps. Well, in Workato, it still stays within the same environment. And that is what I wanted to tell with this presentation. I hope you see that in the end, like what Workato is about is more like encapsulated, easy to use, more governed solution that is self-containing. You don't need to have another app you spin up just because you want to add another use case. And in Microsoft world, like you need to constantly jump between some legacy environment in Power Platform to Azure if you want to do more hard like dev things, but also a lot of other Azure apps, and that is just like typically a very confusing setup, especially if you want to scale it to also low-code users. Thank you.